Hollywood has always been a place where stories sparkle under the lights, where laughter and glamour mask a world of hidden struggles. But sometimes, even in the brightest households, shadows linger. Few could have imagined that Rob Reiner, the beloved filmmaker behind iconic films like When Harry Met Sally and The Princess Bride, would one day face a tragedy so shocking that it would shake not just Hollywood, but everyone who knew his family. The son at the center of this story, Nick Reiner, wasn't a stranger to struggle. Years before any headlines or legal charges, people who crossed paths with him noticed something different, a combination of charm, intelligence, and a darker, more unsettling side. Some might call it intensity, others, a sense of unease that clung to him even in casual conversations. But what does it really mean when someone leaves that kind of impression? Have you ever met someone whose presence lingered in your mind long after they were gone? That's exactly what coworkers and acquaintances would later say about Nick. Even his early attempts to rebuild, rehab, internships, and support from his family, couldn't erase the tension beneath the surface. There were subtle signs, glimpses into a young man grappling with inner battles no one could fully see or fix. And while the world only learned of the tragedy years later, the warning signs were quietly present, etched in the memories of those closest to him. Today, we're going to explore Nick Reiner's story, not as a sensational headline, but as a deep dive into a life that intertwined privilege, opportunity, and struggle in ways that would ultimately culminate in an unspeakable tragedy. We'll look at the people who knew him, the struggles he faced, the attempts to help him, and the moments that hinted something darker was always present. As we move through this story, think about this: how often do we notice the cracks in someone's life and do nothing, assuming everything will be fine? What could have been done differently, if anything at all? This isn't just a story about one family, it's a reflection on the fragile balance between opportunity, support, and the human mind. And with that, let's go back to the beginning, back to the internship that would become the first glimpse of a young man walking a thin line between promise and instability. In 2014, Nick Reiner stepped into Hollywood in a way most young adults could only dream of, or envy. He didn't arrive through auditions, independent projects, or networking the usual way. He arrived with a safety net few ever have: his father, Rob Reiner, a legendary filmmaker whose name carried weight in every corner of the industry. But that doesn't mean it was an easy path, or even a straightforward one. Nick joined the Family Guy crew as an intern, fresh out of rehab, trying to piece together his life after years of personal struggles. It was a chance to rebuild, to get back on track, and, according to those who knew him at the time, a fragile opportunity that carried both hope and pressure. The producers were cautious. They didn't hand him responsibilities, they let him observe, learn, and hang out. In Hollywood terms, it was a favor to his father, a chance to help a young man find his footing, not a fast track to stardom. Even in those early months, people noticed that Nick was different. A production assistant who shadowed him described him as a dark, twisted, kind of rough kid. That phrase might sound harsh at first, but it wasn't meant as judgment. It was an attempt to capture a complexity, a presence that was both magnetic and unsettling. Nick was funny, intelligent, and surprisingly human in his interactions, but there was an undercurrent, a tension, a depth, that made people pause and think, there's more going on here than meets the eye. And it wasn't just personality quirks. Nick had recently come out of rehab, and the fragility of his sobriety was evident to those paying attention. He had also experienced periods of homelessness, and the weight of that instability clung to him even in the structured world of a television set. Watching him navigate a professional environment while carrying personal baggage was like observing someone balancing on a tightrope. They might seem fine in the moment, but one misstep could change everything. The internship itself was structured, almost protective. Rob Reiner personally dropped Nick off each day, and he picked him up afterward, silently guiding him through the routine of work. His father, along with the crew, hoped that structure, support, and a little exposure to the industry would help him regain confidence and stability. And yet, even in this controlled environment, Nick's intensity and unpredictability shone through, enough to leave lasting impressions on everyone who worked with him. It's easy to look back now and wonder, did anyone really notice the cracks forming? Could anyone has predicted the path Nick would later take? The truth is, the signs were there, subtle but persistent, quietly hinting at the inner turbulence that no internship, no favor, and no amount of guidance could entirely contain. And as we'll see next, the impressions he left weren't fleeting, they stayed with people for years, long after he had left the set. From the very first day on the Family Guy set, Nick Reiner made an impression that would linger long after the internship ended. People who spent hours working alongside him couldn't help but notice a mix of traits that were both intriguing and unsettling. One production assistant, who shadowed him for hours each day, described him as a dark, twisted, kind of rough kid, words that, at the time, felt almost too strong. Yet, looking back, they captured something essential about Nick. He wasn't just another young adult trying to make it in Hollywood. He was a person whose humor, intelligence, and presence carried an intensity that left a lasting mark. Nick had a sharp, often biting sense of humor. It could make people laugh, but it also revealed a worldview that was darker than what most people expect in casual conversation. He was quiet and introverted, preferring observation over attention-seeking, yet he carried an energy that drew people in. It was the kind of personality that makes you remember every small interaction, someone who can leave a room quietly but still be impossible to forget. Even as he showed glimpses of normalcy, smiling, joking, engaging in casual work talk, there was an undercurrent of tension. Co-workers sensed that Nick was carrying weight that wasn't obvious to outsiders, the aftermath of rehab, unresolved personal struggles, and a history that had forced him to grow up faster than many of his peers. It was as though he existed in two layers at once, the version he showed to the world and the version that only those paying attention could glimpse. And this duality was part of what made him so memorable. People who met him recall a mix of empathy and unease. They liked him, he was human, funny, and relatable, but there was always a subtle reminder that something was off. It wasn't about danger or malice, it was about intensity and vulnerability. It was the kind of impression that stays with you, replaying in your mind, making you think, I hope he's okay. The production assistant who knew him best admitted years later that Nick stuck in his brain for all these years. That's the thing about certain people, the memories of them linger long after the interactions end. Sometimes it's warmth, sometimes fascination, and sometimes unease. In Nick's case, it was a combination of all three. And for those who knew him, the memory became even more haunting after tragedy struck years later. So while no one at the time could predict what would happen, the early impressions were undeniable. This was someone who carried a darkness alongside his talent, a tension that made people remember him long after he left the room. By the time Nick Reiner stepped onto the Family Guy set, he was navigating a precarious period in his life. Fresh from rehab, he was attempting to rebuild, to reclaim some sense of normalcy after years of personal struggles. But recovery isn't a straight path, and for Nick, every day seemed to carry the weight of past mistakes. People who worked with him could see it in subtle ways, a hesitance, a shadow in his eyes, a quiet intensity that suggested he was fighting battles most wouldn't notice. Nick's sobriety was real, but fragile. Those around him sensed he was putting in the effort, but they also saw moments when the strain was visible. Having experienced homelessness in the past, he carried scars, both physical and emotional, that didn't disappear simply because he had a structured routine on a television set. For someone so young, the pressure of Hollywood, combined with personal history, created a tension that was hard to ignore. Co-workers described Nick as teetering on the edge at times. He could be funny, engaging, and even warm in small doses, but he also displayed a darkness that made interactions unpredictable. One day he might share a clever joke that left everyone laughing, the next, he could retreat into silence or display a brooding intensity that was hard to read. This duality was part of what made him so compelling and so troubling for those who knew him. It wasn't just about behavior, it was about context. A young man trying to recover from rehab while entering the high-pressure world of Hollywood is already vulnerable. Nick had support, guidance, and connections that many would consider a dream, yet the fragility remained. Even in a controlled, structured environment, the tension beneath the surface was palpable. Those who observed him closely noticed the cracks forming, though at the time, no one could predict how significant they might become. And there was another layer to consider. Nick had a spark, a rawness that made him memorable. He was human in every sense, flawed, funny, intense, and complicated. People who worked with him wanted to help, wanted to see him succeed, and in many ways, they tried to protect that spark from being extinguished by his struggles. Yet even with support, structure, and opportunity, some forces are larger than circumstance. It was a delicate balancing act, a young man seeking redemption, surrounded by opportunities and care, yet still teetering on the edge in ways that no one could fully control. Behind every young adult trying to rebuild their life, there's often a family quietly fighting to keep them afloat, and in Nick Reiner's case, that family went above and beyond. Rob Reiner, known to the world as a celebrated filmmaker and actor, was also a father determined to guide his son through one of the most turbulent periods of his life. Every day, Rob personally dropped Nick off at the Family Guy set, stayed in contact with the production team, and made sure he had structure, routine, and supervision. It was more than support, it was a lifeline. The Reiners seemed determined to give Nick every possible opportunity. They provided access to Hollywood mentors, encouraged him to explore creative avenues like stand-up comedy, and tried to cultivate environments where he could thrive. On the surface, it may have looked like privilege, but for Nick, it was also pressure, a daily reminder of the expectations and hopes pinned on him by those who loved him most. And yet, even with the best intentions, love and opportunity could only go so far. The darkness that had been noticed by co-workers, the humor tinged with intensity, the quiet brooding energy, the struggles with sobriety, was still present. Rob and Michelle weren't just offering guidance, they were attempting to counteract forces that were deeply internal, forces that no parent could fully control. The daily routine was both comforting and revealing. Watching Nick navigate work, while seeing the subtle moments when he faltered or retreated, offered the Reiners glimpses into his inner world. They were aware that this wasn't simply a phase or a temporary challenge. There were cracks forming, subtle but persistent, hints of the inner tension that had already made such a strong impression on those around him. It's worth pausing here to consider the emotional weight of this kind of parenting. How do you guide someone when you see them teetering between potential and peril? How do you provide opportunities and still prepare for the possibility that they might stumble? The Reiners lived this reality every day, balancing hope with worry, love with concern, and opportunity with caution. Despite their tireless efforts, the daily interactions eventually faded as the internship ended, leaving behind memories, questions, and a lingering unease about what might happen next. After the internship ended, Nick Reiner's presence in Hollywood quietly receded. The friendships he had formed on set, those fleeting connections with people who had glimpsed both his humor and his darkness, did not survive the transition back to normal life. Social media offered a thread of connection, but it was thin and impersonal. For those who had worked closely with him, he became a memory, a young man whose brief presence left a lasting impression, now slipping out of sight. This period of disappearance wasn't dramatic or sensational at the time. There were no headlines, no public incidents, no warnings flashing across news feeds. It was the mundane fading that sometimes happens when someone drifts, someone who carries both potential and instability, yet disappears before anyone can fully grasp the trajectory of their life. Yet, in hindsight, those years of quiet absence are eerily significant. They marked the time when warning signs were largely unobserved, when the tension that had lingered under the surface continued to grow unnoticed. For those who had known him, the memory of Nick became a puzzle, flashes of brilliance, humor, and intelligence intertwined with shadows of intensity, fragility, and unpredictability. Co-workers remembered his dark, twisted sense of humor, the intensity that seemed almost out of proportion to his surroundings, and the quiet hints of someone struggling beneath the surface. Looking back, it's easy to see how these fragments of personality foreshadowed a deeper turmoil, yet at the time, they seemed like isolated quirks or youthful intensity. And then, life moved forward, Hollywood carried on, friends drifted apart, and Nick's story faded from daily thought. But the memory of him never fully disappeared. It lingered in conversations, in recollections, and in the minds of those who had spent even a few hours observing him navigate his world. These quiet memories would later collide with shocking news, forcing people to reconcile the boy they had once known with the tragedy that unfolded years later. And then came the day that no one could ignore, a day when the past and present collided in the most devastating way. December 14, 2025, began like any other day, but it would end in a tragedy that shocked Hollywood and the world beyond. Rob and Michelle Reiner, parents who had given their son support, opportunity, and love, were found deceased in their Brentwood home. The discovery sent immediate shockwaves, not just through the entertainment industry, but through everyone who had known or worked with the family. For people who remembered Nick from years earlier, the news was almost unimaginable, prompting them to revisit early memories of a young man who had seemed complicated, intense, and at times troubled. The sequence of events was swift. Authorities responded to a call at the Reiner home, and it quickly became clear that both Rob and Michelle had suffered fatal injuries. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office would later confirm that multiple sharp force injuries were the cause of death. While the exact circumstances remained under investigation, the sheer suddenness of the tragedy left friends, co-workers, and neighbors stunned. Nick Reiner was soon identified as a person of interest in the investigation. Within hours, law enforcement arrested him, beginning a legal process that would bring intense scrutiny to the family and reignite memories of his past struggles. For those who had known him as an intern or a young man attempting to rebuild his life, the arrest forced a collision of past impressions and present reality. The boy they had observed, funny, intense, fragile, and dark, was now at the center of a story that no one could have predicted. This day marked a turning point, a moment where the quiet warning signs from years earlier were cast in an entirely new light. People who had once simply wondered about Nick's stability or his intensity were now forced to reconcile those early impressions with a tragedy that no amount of hindsight could have fully prepared them for. And as the investigation unfolded, the world watched a family's story twist from one of hope and care into a narrative of shock, sorrow, and unanswered questions. Within hours of being named a person of interest, Nick Reiner was arrested, a development that stunned everyone who had known him, both personally and professionally. Authorities charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder, including a special circumstance for multiple murders, and alleged that he had used a dangerous weapon, a knife. The charges carried the possibility of life in prison without parole, and prosecutors had not yet decided whether to seek the death penalty. Each detail added layers of gravity to a situation that was already unfathomable for friends, family, and acquaintances alike. Nick made his first court appearance just days later. The courtroom was tense and heavy, a stark contrast to the media frenzy outside. He spoke only once, quietly agreeing to a continuance requested by his high-profile defense attorney. That single response, brief and almost clinical, left an unsettling impression on everyone present. Observers noted the silence, the gravity of the moment, and the weight of what had transpired in the weeks leading up to the arraignment. For those who had once worked with Nick, the courtroom was a jarring reminder of the young man they had known, charming at times, fragile, intense, and struggling with inner turmoil. It forced people to reconcile memories of a boy navigating life and work in Hollywood with the shocking reality now dominating headlines. Many wondered, how had someone so loved and supported by his family, so given every opportunity, arrived at this point? How do the warning signs of a troubled life go unnoticed until tragedy strikes? The legal process was only beginning. With arraignments, court appearances, and potential sentencing looming, the story would continue to unfold in public view, adding layers of speculation, fear, and reflection. And yet, amidst the headlines and the courtroom drama, one question remained in the minds of everyone who had known him: could the signs have been recognized earlier, and could intervention have changed the outcome? Even in the silence of a courtroom, the echoes of those early impressions, the dark humor, the intensity, the fragility, resonated, leaving people to grapple with the reality of what had happened and the haunting question of what could have been done differently. Looking back, the story of Nick Reiner is a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be, and how the warning signs of deeper struggles often go unnoticed until it's too late. From his early challenges with sobriety and periods of homelessness to the intensity, darkness, and humor that lingered in the memories of those who knew him, there were glimpses of an inner unrest long before tragedy struck. The signs were subtle, moments of brooding silence, bursts of dark humor, and intensity that was both fascinating and unsettling, but in retrospect, they were impossible to ignore. Rob and Michelle Reiner did everything they could to help their son. They provided structure, guidance, opportunities, and unwavering love. They encouraged him, supported him, and tried to create spaces where he could succeed. And yet, even the most devoted family, armed with privilege and resources, cannot always shield someone from their inner battles. There are forces, internal and invisible, that no amount of guidance can fully control. For those who crossed paths with Nick, the memories now carry a new weight. The boy they once knew, a person of humor, talent, intensity, and fragility, has become a figure tied to tragedy, forcing friends, colleagues, and strangers to reconcile the past with the present in ways that are both unsettling and heartbreaking. It's a reminder that even when someone seems to be rebuilding, their struggles may run deeper than anyone realizes. And for the rest of us, the story is a reflection on the delicate balance between opportunity, support, and human vulnerability. How often do we notice the cracks in someone's life and assume everything will be fine? How often do small warning signs go overlooked until they culminate in something unimaginable? It's a chilling thought, but one that underscores the importance of observation, empathy, and intervention when possible. In the end, the warnings were there all along, whispering quietly in memories and moments that seemed ordinary at the time. The question that lingers now is stark, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. Did anyone see them in time, and even if they did, could anything have truly been done to change the outcome?